Okay, welcome back to round 3, session 3. Hope you were able to stretch your legs and have a bite to eat. It's my distinct pleasure now to introduce my own colleague here at Gordon College, Dr. Jennifer Hevelone-Harper. Dr. Hevelone-Harper is a graduate from this college, where she was a star undergraduate a number of years ago. After finishing at Gordon, she went on to earn her MA at the University of Chicago and her PhD at Princeton University. Her teaching areas include late antiquity, Byzantium, early Islam, and medieval and early modern Europe. She's published a number of articles and book chapters, including recent contributions to a volume entitled A History of World Civilizations from a Christian Perspective and the Journal of Syriac Studies. She is the author of Disciples of the Desert, Monks, Laity, and Spiritual Authority in the 6th Century, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. For many years here, she's taught a very popular class entitled Medieval Islam, in which she introduces students to Islam, both from a historical perspective, but also from a belief or theological perspective. She's going to be reflecting on her efforts, these pedagogical efforts in this class, in a paper entitled Mohammed Among Evangelicals, Teaching the Origins and Spread of Islam in an Evangelical College Context. So let's welcome her up here.
Good afternoon and welcome to our conference. The question of teaching about Islam in a Christian college or a church-related college is keenly relevant to me because today my students from medieval Islam in the Middle East are right here among us. So it's not an abstract issue for me. I began teaching this course at Gordon College in the spring of 2001. Now, I am not an Islamist by training. I don't read Arabic. I'm a scholar of late antiquity. I study and write on Egypt and Syria and Gaza, Palestine and Sinai in the 6th century, so the era before the coming of Islam. So I knew enough from my own broad graduate training to know that the history of early Islam was a subject that students at a liberal arts college needed to learn about. And I'd already taught the rise of Islam in our core Western Civ class many times. So I volunteered to teach this course on early Islam at Gordon. And then after I volunteered, I buckled down to do the reading and to beg syllabi from my colleagues and prepare myself to teach this class. Now, teaching the history of the rise and expansion of Islam at a small liberal arts college brings some challenges. Foremost is the awareness that we are a less religiously diverse institution than many schools of higher learning. We have no Muslims as permanent members of our academic community. Faculty and students at Gordon College all profess Christian commitment. This does not mean we're homogenous, though. In my course, Medieval Islam in the Middle East, I've had many students of Middle Eastern descent, students who have studied and lived in the Middle East, students belonging to Eastern Christian churches, students whose families have lived and worked in Muslim countries, and students who have friends and family members who are Muslims. So there are many personal connections that draw students to this subject. And we discuss the advantages and limitations of studying a religious tradition as outsiders to that group. Students read scholars who are increasingly aware of their own relationship with their field of study. Now, the first semester that I taught this class in the spring of 2001, I had only a handful of students, and I felt the need to make a very strong case for why students at an evangelical Christian institution should learn about Islam and should also read the Quran. I explained to them that Islam was a fast-growing religion, both globally and in the United States. Muslims are a diverse group coming from many different countries and ethnic backgrounds with different understandings of their own history. And I posited that Christian students in particular should have a well-grounded understanding of Islam. This was not so that they might convert to Islam, nor that they might convert Muslims to Christianity, but so that they could have a well-informed, articulate conversation with Muslim coworkers, neighbors, friends. I wanted my students to see the connection between Islam and Christianity, monotheistic Abrahamic religions with shared roots in the Middle East, as well as to recognize the areas in which these religions differ, particularly in the Christian doctrines of Trinity and Incarnation. You'll see then that from the very beginning of my teaching here, I placed the need to study historical Islam within the context of understanding contemporary Islam. We studied the past not merely for its own sake, but so that we could be more discerning participants in our own time. What happened in the 7th century, or the 9th century, or the 13th century has direct connection to how we live in the 21st century. At an evangelical institution like Gordon, I can be very explicit with my students about the biblical mandate for studying history. Jesus said the greatest commandments were to love God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And I argue that we cannot effectively love our neighbors, in this case Muslim neighbors, if we don't know anything about their history. It'd be like trying to welcome a new member of your department or a new student on your dorm floor and not asking where they came from. So when I taught this course for the second time at Gordon College, it was in the fall of 2002, and the attention of America had been seized by the tragic events of 9/11. There were many voices in academia and the public square that echoed the need for Americans to know something about Islam. Enrollment in my course rose a modest 29%, from 14 students to 18 students. And this was in a period before, at Gordon College, before we required either non-Western history for history majors or global understanding as a thematic core for the whole student body. Both of those things are now requirements. Now, my course, Medieval Islam, fulfills both these requirements, and more than half of the students come from majors outside of history, which gives it a very interdisciplinary flavor. Recent class sizes have ranged between 20 and 30 students. While few people post 9/11 still thought that Islam ought to be relegated to history books, I did realize that my first inclination was sound. Teaching Islam to undergraduates had to be done within the context of preparing them to be thoughtful world citizens. I couldn't just teach them about Islam in the 7th century. We had to make connections between historical Islam and Muslim practice in the present. My course depends on pedagogical practices that are common to history courses in general. We learn the geography of the Middle East to better equip ourselves to recognize where to place places and events. We read primary sources written by eyewitnesses in the past, and we read modern scholarship by specialists in the field. Our students lead discussions, they write exams, but there are 2 assignments in my course that I wanted to talk to you about today. These assignments are aimed at intentionally drawing connections between the past and the present. And these are the current events report and also a visit to a local mosque to observe Friday prayers. For the current events report, students choose a news article dealing with some aspect of Islam. They evaluate the perspective of the author, and they draw connections with readings in the Quran and their study of Islamic history. For instance, if they choose an article on Islamic banking practices, from The Economist magazine, the students have to go looking in the Quran for prohibitions on lending money at interest. Students should then go on to consider the historical prohibitions against usury that are in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And they have to ask, what is it that made these 3 Abrahamic faiths at one point or another frown upon money lending? And how did Jews and Christians make their peace with charging interest? And what today can financial institutions do to observe the Quranic prohibitions on interest, but still reward investors who take on risk? Now, students often find striking connections between events in Muhammad's life and the ethical standards of modern Muslims, for instance, in the treatment of orphans. At other times, there seems to be cultural dissonance between the directives of the Quran and today's accepted norm in Muslim-majority countries. Why is it that the Quran condemned female infanticide and provided legal protection for daughters, but the status of girls' education in many Muslim countries lags? Reading the headlines to prepare for the current events reports helps broaden students' perceptions of global Islam today. They recognize the diverse experience of Muslims who might live in Europe or North America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa. The students must examine critically the operating assumptions and the possible biases behind journalists' portrayal of Muslims, and they learn to spot stereotypes very quickly. For too long, Western scholars saw the Middle East and Islamic culture as static and unchanging. This current event assignment encourages students to consider both continuity and change in religious practice. It highlights the various hermeneutical lenses that believers use to interpret sacred texts. And for Christian students, this comparison of foundational teachings and contemporary practices is useful, not only for building a more nuanced understanding of Islam, which it does, but the exercise also helps students examine their own faith traditions more critically. At the same time that they are developing empathy for religious others, students mature in their own religious identity. The current events report makes students pay attention to what is happening in the world today, but they can do it from the relative isolation of their own laptop. Now, hopefully they branch out, they read a new publication they're familiar with. Maybe it's the Wall Street Journal, maybe it's Al Jazeera. But generally, there's not much risk-taking involved in this assignment. Another assignment I require does exactly the opposite. It propels students out of their comfort zones, sometimes with unexpected results. As a professor, I am deeply committed to the practice of field trips. Every history course I teach requires at least one trip to a museum in the Boston area or to a local community of worship. When I teach my Byzantine history course, we all go visit an Orthodox church. So it was natural when I began to teach this course on Islamic history to require a visit to a local mosque. The purpose of the visit is to ensure that every semester students have some interaction with Muslims and the opportunity to ask them questions. In my years of teaching this course, I visited at least 4 different mosques with students, 2 of those mosques many times. Students are required to write reflective essays on their visit, analyzing both their expectations before their visit and their experiences, their responses to their experience visiting and observing prayers. These essays and the discussions with students after their visit reveals the varied responses of evangelical Christian students to local Muslim communities. And from this body of evidence that I've been collecting over the years, I've chosen 3 themes from student responses to share with you today. First, I want to talk about the common tone in preaching in mosque and evangelical churches. Second, I will speak of a sense of ambiguity in encounters with Muslims at mosques that my students experience. And third, their startled response to the experience of gender segregation. So, to begin with, on the evangelical flavor of sermons. Frequently, students have found the sermons preached at mosques to contain language that feels familiar to preaching they have heard within their own church tradition. Exhortations to lead moral lives, to follow God's commands even when those around you do not, to choose the right path even when easier options abound. All these appeals resonate with the moral training of young evangelicals. Specific injunctions might be unfamiliar, the call to perform the Hajj, or warnings against wedding celebrations which relax gender segregation. But the underlying appeal to sacrificial obedience and sexual purity resonate with the religious formation of young evangelicals. As one student explained, something that surprised me about the service was the sermon that the imam gave, partially because the sermon resembled sermons I'd heard in any other church. It was a message about purity and how sometimes we make allowances in our lives to the rules because of different situations. Particularly, he discussed the temptation of women and sexual desires and how to be holy, and that focusing on your spirituality was key. Students appreciated the direct call by the imam to his listeners to lead a moral life. The ethical demands of Islam resonated with their own Christian upbringing. Students admired the high standards expected of individual Muslim and recognized that people might fall short of the ideal. One question posed by one of my students after listening to a sermon at a mosque has certainly been asked of Christian congregations as well. He said, "I wonder how much of an influence that message had upon the attendees, and if they are doing anything different in their lives as a result." Another characteristic of Muslim preaching that appealed to evangelical students was the imam's attention to the question of how to live integrally as a Muslim in the religiously pluralistic environment of modern America. Many evangelical Christians, particularly here in New England, are aware of their own status as religious minorities in a broader secular society. The encounter with Muslims, a religious minority in the U.S., who proclaim their faith commitments through actions, observing prayers, and by dress, wearing the hijab for women, often creates feelings of affinity or respect among young evangelicals. Evangelical students recognize the difficulty in trying to live a distinctively religious life when those religious commitments are not supported by societal structures. Let me share with you how one student put it. To me, it was a politically charged sermon, but nothing unlike what many Christian pastors tell their own congregations, and certainly was religiously relevant for the congregation. It made me somewhat sympathetic to the ideas that he was expressing, because his argument was that America is not friendly towards Muslims because they refuse to separate religion from the rest of their lives. And as Christians, I feel like we should be doing the same. Christians should seek to avoid pluralisms in their life and not seek to be of this world. American evangelicals and American Muslims share tensions inherent in living religiously committed lives in a secular public context. In considering the sermon of one imam, another student reflected, I realized that we were both coming at life from a deeply religious outlook, and in fact, we're probably concerned with the same things. The ideological warfare he mentioned is something that Christians can relate to. Both Christians and Muslims live in a world which is becoming ever more secularized and moving ever away from the traditional values and morals they hold dear. Most of the West is considered to be post-Christian, and secular values are replacing the Christian values in Western society. This imam and I were not so different. We were both living in a society that we found was becoming ever more distant from us in beliefs, values, and lifestyles. So sermons preached at mosque forged empathetic connections between evangelical students and their Muslim neighbors. Sometimes, however, the experience of visiting a mosque actually served to heighten an awareness of difference between Christian students and Muslim hosts. Some students who had idealistically embraced the class readings even felt disappointed with their lived encounters with religious others. So now I will consider the theme that comes from my student response as a theme of ambiguity. Drawing upon a traditional liberal arts approach to teaching history, I exposed students in my medieval Islam and Middle East course to a wide variety of historical sources. They examine primary sources and modern scholarly analyses. They explore art and architecture. They learn to appreciate medieval Islamic science and learning. Students encounter Islam in a range of political and ethnic contexts. We recognize the key role Muslim scholars serve in preserving knowledge and transmitting it to Western Europe. And in our current events assignments, we learn to be media savvy and alert to subtle stereotyping. In class discussion, I encourage an open-minded reading of the Quran and its various interpreters. At the same time, I caution my students that the traditional way of learning the Quran is not to sit down and read it as a textbook, but to be immersed in a community where its recitation shapes the pattern of life. Sometimes, however, the thoughtful considerations of the classroom break down in the messy embodiment of real human life. One common component of student response to visiting a mosque is ambiguity, or maybe even stronger, disappointment. The idealistic expectations of students are sometimes abruptly overturned. Here's one student's first reaction to a rather heated sermon by a visiting Palestinian imam. Honestly, I was quite shocked at all of this. Every time he would accuse America of something, I found myself trying to protect what we had done, our involvement in Afghanistan and our troops in Iraq. After a few minutes, I was becoming agitated and did not feel very comfortable anymore. The warm, friendly atmosphere that had existed 10 minutes before had left the building. Here around me were Muslims angry at the country most of them had immigrated to. Disappointment washed over me. I had thought I would find Muslims who would be supportive of America, who would take pride in the country they had traveled half the world to come to. But instead, ideas of Muslims hate America and they hate us for who we are seemed to be coming true right before my eyes. This disappointment lasted for the rest of the sermon. The initial hopes of evangelical students that they have for quickly finding common ground with Muslim neighbors can evaporate when they encounter political worldviews that seem to oppose their own. Many students find critiques of U.S. involvement in the Middle East unsettling. Negative views of U.S. foreign policy are not the only challenges for students to digest. Sometimes students realize that problems they have studied in neutral academic terms carry greater existential stakes in real life. One of my students once asked an imam if the Shia-Sunni division was as pronounced among Muslim immigrants to the U.S. as it was in media reports of the Middle East. The imam quickly responded that there were no divisions among American Muslims because the Shia were simply not Muslims. The abruptness of this response stunned the students. And in our debriefing sessions, I had to remind students that there are points in Christian history when Catholics and Protestants have held very similar views of each other. In encounters with Muslims, Christian students sometimes realize that their own religious assumptions about Muslim belief and practice were not well informed. Evangelical students observing Muslim prayers are generally impressed by the simplicity, sincerity, and piety displayed. They also value the regular cycle of prayers that punctuate the hours of a Muslim's day. They admire the ethnic and racial diversity of Muslim congregations. Indeed, international fashions adorning the worshipers on the women's side always earn appreciative comments from female students. But evangelical students are also troubled that a Muslim must only pray in Arabic, even if a new convert knows no Arabic. The apparent lack of spontaneous or intercessory prayer seems troubling to evangelical students who value free-form communication with God. What had appeared to the students at first to be informal communal worship, upon closer examination proved more structured than many had initially assumed. But by far, the most startling experience for my students took place not during the service of prayers, but in the informal question and answer period that followed. This brings us to the issue of gender segregation. Last year, I visited a mosque, which I had brought students to on several previous occasions. And in our preparations for the field trip, I'm always very explicit to tell students how to dress, both male and female students, and go over the etiquette for observing Friday prayers. The female students in my group paid careful attention to dress modestly with long, loose skirts and to cover their hair with scarves. They rode together in one van to our destination so they could share hairpins and help adjust one another's head coverings. One student later noted the strange feeling that accompanied this simple gesture. As soon as I put the scarf over my hair, I realized that this getup would make hearing difficult, but also that it would restrict my peripheral vision. These observations seemed like a setback, but nevertheless, I was extremely excited. In the van, these female students also passed the time compiling lists of questions about Islam, which they wished to ask our hosts. The students knew that men and women would pray in two separate areas. They carefully followed the worshipers to the correct entrances, removed their shoes, and settled themselves on the floor in the back of the women's section to observe. One female student describes the prayers being led by an invisible voice, the imam addressing the group of men on the other side of the divider. The students enjoyed the informal atmosphere of the women praying together. Women continued to arrive throughout the service, often with young children who were gently guided to follow the gestures of the adults. What surprised all the evangelical students was that following the service, in the question and answer time with the imam, the gender segregation continued. This had not been the case on previous class visits to this particular mosque, where we had the male and female students meet with the imam as a whole group. Let me read you how one male student described the experience. We were escorted out of the main room into a similarly carpeted overflow chamber with a divider down the middle. The veiled women were escorted to the other side of the divider. It provides a very interesting contrast, especially as the imam talked solely to our side of the room, as though the women didn't exist. Yet he waited until they arrived to really start the event. He clearly did this for religious reasons, but I find it interesting he didn't go to other efforts to include them, especially after focusing on the role of the mosque as a community center. The thing that the division reminded me of was the Pharisees in the Gospels and how they built walls around walls. They would make rules about how you could only travel a certain amount on the Sabbath just to prevent the possibility of accidentally breaking the law. This approach by the imam to prevent the possibility of lust or undesired emotion piqued the same response from me. The imam didn't even want to see their faces or hear their voices just because of the possibility of that. However, he still mentioned in the sermon that if lust were to occur, you would go into an unclean state and all you had to do was pray to Allah, and then you would be clean again. The uncertainty felt by the male students was magnified for the female students. The women in our class reacted more personally to the experience, as one describes. I really felt invisible, and I thought how Muslim women can live without ever being able to speak to other men but their husbands. It was sad to see that girls from our class could not ask questions and looked startled. I feel like we were treated as dangerous beings. The female students were very frustrated that they had no opportunity to ask the questions they had carefully compiled. The gender segregation during the question and answer period became the defining experience of the visit that year for both male and female students. Their discomfort increased when the young imam shared his own background with the male students. He had grown up in the United States, the son of secular Pakistani parents. After attending a public American high school and university, he had traveled to Pakistan for religious training and returned to this American mosque, introducing a stricter level of gender segregation. My students agreed in our discussion following the visit that it would have been much easier to accept the exclusion of the female student and the female professor if the imam had been raised in a country that practiced strict gender segregation. The fact that a young man raised in American culture would choose to implement such practices was harder for my students to accept than if it had merely been the cultural norm of his own upbringing. As a teacher, I've got mixed feelings about these experiences my students have gained from their visit to mosques. On the one hand, I strive to present in the classroom a balanced view of Islamic doctrine and practice. I cultivate an appreciation for diverse textures of Muslim societies over the course of 6 centuries, and this broad sweep of history can then just be overshadowed by the single encounter with one modern-day Muslim community in Massachusetts. The visit to observe Friday prayers at a mosque inevitably proves to be the highlight of the course for students. All the students rate this field trip as extremely important. As one student put it, "This visit made me realize once again how personal experience can help one understand and experience different cultures and people. Moments like these are very important during a learning process because people can forget what they learned, but it's hard to forget what they experienced." Appreciative of the power of experiential learning, I find myself wanting to bring students to several different mosques over the course of a semester so that they can have several discrete experiences from which to generalize. And perhaps so that their strong impressions from this embodied learning can be more balanced, less idiosyncratic. But I have yet to work in multiple field trips into the syllabus that should also cover the Seljuk Turks, Fatimid Egypt, the Crusades, and the Mongols. The need to provide longer and more nuanced interactions with Muslims over the course of the semester was brought home to me the year that Gordon hosted a Fulbright scholar, a professor of Islamic studies and an imam from Nigeria. He spent 3 weeks at Gordon. He attended my medieval Islam course throughout his stay, and my students were able to speak with him in a number of settings about a range of topics. Real rapport and friendship were forged over the course of those 3 weeks. Hard conversations about differences in religious practice between Islam and Christianity were certainly present. I remember one particularly heated discussion about the social benefits of polygamy. But the difference in this encounter was that my students had to respond not to someone they had only met that day, who might appear as a 2-dimensional snapshot of a Muslim, but to a person they had time to grow to know in a deeper level, whom they saw more clearly as a whole person. And when our Fulbright scholar accompanied us on a field trip to a local mosque, students gained an even more valuable experience. In our question and answering time after the service, and this time it wasn't segregated by gender, it grew quite heated because there was a visiting imam from the Middle East who began to challenge Christian teachings directly and to really attempt to proselytize my students who are visiting from a Christian college. Now, our guest from Nigeria saw this as a direct breach of the hospitality that the mosque should be offering to its visitors, and he began to defend the Christian identity and morals of the students who were hosting him. Now, there was a third imam, a local leader of the mosque, who displayed more typically American social skills. He was working to de-escalate the tensions between these two visiting imams. Now, the evangelical students are accustomed to vigorous dialogue on religious matters, and they were not particularly disturbed by the imam's attack on Christianity. But our Nigerian scholar, however, was deeply upset by the aggressive stance of the other imam. And we had heard enough of his own stories of Christian-Muslim conflict in Nigeria to understand the root of his concern. The students had not expected the polemical tone of the imam, and they would have preferred to pose their questions in a less charged atmosphere. However, I would say that the students learned quite a bit from observing Muslim leaders from different geographic backgrounds negotiate their own differences. They're used to Christian leaders arguing with one another, right? We see that all the time. But this was a different matter, and this group of students would never make the mistake of thinking that Islam was monolithic. The contrast between what my students gained from a 3-week period of interacting with a visiting Fulbright scholar from Nigeria and their varied reactions to a single field trip is instructive. There's clearly significant value in learning about Imam from a practicing Muslim. I may answer a question on Islamic teaching or practice with the same identical answer that the Imam offered, but the student would hear it differently when they're being taught by someone who can embody that faith tradition. In the relational context, a Muslim's explanation of his religion is more satisfying to students than material from their readings or from their professor's lecture. So that leaves us with the question, what are we to do at an evangelical Christian college that requires all faculty to support a faith statement reflecting historic Christian teaching? Well, I will be blunt and say I'm enough of a proponent of Christian higher education that I'm not wishing to see this faith statement requirement for faculty changed. But I would suggest that it would be useful to expand the category of visiting scholars to allow students enrolled in medieval Islam in the Middle East to every year interact in an unhurried fashion with a person who could authentically share with them his or her understanding and experiences being a committed Muslim. This would necessitate a strong institutional commitment to offering hospitality to Muslim scholars. But at an evangelical school with the record of having hosted as many rabbis as Gordon has under Dr. Wilson's tenure, I think we certainly have an advantage when it comes to interfaith conversations. I think there are possibilities out there. It seems perhaps that a history class in a Christian liberal arts college is a good beginning place to introduce students to the early history of Islam, as well as a basic literacy about what Muslims believe and value today. At a Christian liberal arts college like Gordon, we're spared the hyper-specialization of the large research university. No faculty at Gordon, as far as I know, feel their turf is threatened when I, a medievalist, make my students analyze global news reports. Even as I focus on the rise and spread of classical Islam, I can freely draw connections with events of our own day. Evangelical Christian students are motivated to better understand their Muslim neighbors. They see medieval history as having a direct relevance to the 21st century world that they inhabit. Students cite visiting a mosque as a significant learning experience that shapes the way they think about the world. So a one-day field trip, though limited in what it can expose students to, is clearly valuable. Paired with longer interactions with Muslim scholars and visitors, a more nuanced understanding of Islam could be achieved. Christian students who have gained a basic understanding of Islam are well positioned to contribute to conversations about religious identities in a pluralistic society. And perhaps this experience will ultimately make my students both more loving neighbors and better historians. Thank you.